All right, we might make a slow start to thank those of you that have managed to join us on the hour. I think a few people will keep rolling in. We have just under 400 registrations for this webinar, which is fantastic, from people all over the world, including those in the US and Canada where it is the middle of the night. So I do hope nobody has dialed in from there and that you've registered so you can get the recording later. So this will be recorded and be put up on the website. For those of you in Australia, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that you are on, elders past and present, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that might be joining us for the next hour. So I have been looking forward to this. In COVID land, this is kind of the only thing that I have to do now that I can't go to restaurants, hang in bars, or do anything social. So this is my favorite thing to do, and interview and speak to interesting people in our various systems doing important work to change the lives for people all over the world. So I want to introduce you to the two folks speaking today. We have Joe Taylor, the Chief Capability Officer with the Paul Ramsay Foundation, and Ravi Gurumurthy, damn it, I practiced it, Gurumurthy from Nesta, the new CEO of Nesta. I'll have each of them introduce themselves with their backgrounds rather than me do a very poor job of it, and describe a little bit about each of the organizations that they're running. And from there, we're going to get into the topic. If you would have any IT problems, please put it in the chat box. And if you have some questions, please post them in the Q&A box. I will be watching that and curating some of the questions for our two speakers today. So just put them down as you have them coming up, and I'll make sure I read them. Can I go to the next slide for a second? I'm just going to top and tail a little bit about these summits. This webinar series is in honor of keeping the momentum going towards our next Evidence and Implementation Summit 2021. It is in Sydney, 30th and 31st of March. We have recently announced we're moving to a hybrid event that is a combination of online and in person, with sister smaller events happening in person in probably Singapore and London. So please start thinking about your abstracts, your panels, your proposals that you would like to submit. You can now join the conference from anywhere in the world. And we promise those of you that are joining online, we will make it quite the experience and not endless watching of presentations and not and you sort of falling asleep. So it's going to be dynamic, and it's going to be great. It's going to be global, with some sort of side in-person events. Can we go back to the original slide of the heading? So I will ask Joe to just introduce yourself first, Joe, your background, and a little bit about Paul Ramsay and what you guys are working on at the moment. Then I'll move to Ravi, and then I'll start with some of the questions.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks everybody. Quite frightening to see how many people are around today. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us on the webinar. I've worked in philanthropy in the social sector for over 20 years, and I've been lucky enough to most of that to work in philanthropy, funding projects and organisations globally. But I feel exceptionally lucky that I've also been on the other side of the fence. So I've run organisations, I've started them up, I've closed them down, and so I feel like I kind of understand not only what it takes to fund, but also what it's like to receive funding, and sometimes the reporting and the restrictions that are around that. 4 years ago, I joined the Paul Ramsay Foundation, which is quite a young foundation in Australia, and we're also the largest kind of foundation. So I often describe how we're really trying not to be the toddler in the playground, kind of because of our size of our endowment and our distribution, but really we're at the beginning of the journey of how we can create impact in Australia. And we were about to launch a new strategy that we'd developed over 12 months just before COVID happened. And our directors made the really brilliant decision that we would put that to one side, we would respond to bushfires, COVID-19, and also how we could sustain our partners. And we also made the decision that we would boost our funding as well in response to kind of the crisis. So there's been heaps of learning over the last 4 years about how as a foundation we can try and find the right things to fund. And I'm super excited about this conversation because we often have conversations internally about what's our theory of action and impact and how does evidence and innovation fit into that. So thanks, Robin.
Fabulous, Jo. Ravi, if you could introduce yourself and also a little bit about Nesta for folks that might not be familiar.
Thank you, Robin. Yes, I'm Ravi Gurumurthy, and I'm the Chief Executive of Nesta. Nesta is the UK's innovation foundation. We actually started off life just over 20 years ago as a government agency with an endowment, with a real mission focused on promoting and supporting innovation. We then became an independent charity about 8 years ago, and we now do a lot of different things, from prizes and grant giving to investing, but also researching and convening. I've started at Nesta just at the beginning of this year. My previous role was as the Chief Innovation Officer at the International Rescue Committee. I set up something called the Airbell Impact Lab, which was all about designing, testing and scaling new solutions. And it's very much that active focus on catalysing new solutions that I'm bringing to Nesta.
Fabulous, thank you. Well then, let's get started. So I'd like each of you to spend 5 to 7 minutes responding firstly to the title of this webinar, is evidence-informed innovation an oxymoron? And I know there was a bit of action on Twitter before that. So Ravi, I might start with you and then go up to Jo and we'll take it.
Well, yeah, Robin, when you posted the title, I said, I just tweeted back no, and people said it's going to be quite a short talk and a short event. And actually, it's something I'm strangely passionate about, which is a slightly odd thing to be passionate about, but I am, because sometimes when I've confronted the innovation world, I get frustrated that people in the innovation community sometimes treat evidence as an oxymoron, as something that almost to set their face against, because they're going to chart new and original paths that don't really build on or informed by evidence. So I do actually feel quite strongly about this question. In some ways, preparing for this made me just challenge myself a little bit about, are there examples where evidence shouldn't inform innovation? And so let me say a little bit about, firstly, why I think it should, but also where are the tensions and where are the deviations? First of all, let's perhaps just define our terms. When I think about innovation, I think about new and better solutions. And even the new, I think, is often a mixture of things that are genuinely new, some things are borrowed, some things are stolen, some things are adapted. So it's a newish. And then the critical thing is better. And I think that's sometimes missed in innovation processes, because how do you know through that process that you are genuinely building solutions that are impactful and better than what goes before? And for me, if it's not new and better, then it's just novelty. It's not genuine innovation. And then when it comes to evidence, while I think it's right to lean quite heavily on rigorous evaluation methods, experimental methods like randomized controlled trials, and when I'm saying better, I think it should mean better in the sense that you've rigorously evaluated it. Evidence obviously comes in lots of different forms at different stages of the innovation life cycle. And I think you want to be informed by all those different sources of evidence depending on the maturity of your project. So at the outset, you might be informed by basic science on theories of change. Over time, you might be informed by feedback and measurement of before and after a program. And later on, you're informed by implementation science. So that's what I mean by, I think, evidence and innovation. I was thinking about different programs that illustrated how evidence informs innovation. And one example would be the number of programs where you're not really innovating in a new intervention, but you're innovating in the delivery system to get something to scale. And often when we talk about scaling and innovation, people go, well, that's just almost boring. That's just doing more of it, getting more money, rolling it out. But often the act of scaling involves quite a lot of innovation, particularly in challenging contexts that I've worked in before. So to give you one example, tackling malnutrition in South Sudan, when I was working on this in the International Rescue Committee, we weren't trying to reinvent Plumpy-Nut and how you diagnose and treat a child with malnutrition. What we were trying to solve for is how do you get children and families in South Sudan who might be 30 miles from a clinic, who might have to walk through wind and rain to get there, to actually have access to health treatment. And in many contexts, you've seen community health workers play that role rather than clinic-based care in other diseases, but it's very difficult in that context because you've got health workers who lack the literacy and numeracy to measure a child's arm circumference or take a patient's name and details. So in that context, we were creating tools like a color-coded measuring tape, a patient register with no names and letters to enable community-based delivery of malnutrition treatment. I think that's a good example of a delivery system innovation. Similarly, if I think about parenting programs, we conducted lots of rigorous evaluations of parenting programs which showed they did have an effect on reducing harsh parenting, but they were several $100s per person because they were based on small group tuition or one-to-one tuition. And therefore, what we tried to do is then innovate in the delivery mechanism and the dosage. And can you do some things digitally, some things face-to-face? Can you perhaps do things in slightly bigger groups? And that was really about, innovating in the delivery system and the dosage. I think that the second illustration of using evidence was where we're sort of inspired by evidence in an analogous situation, and that forms the basis of a newish thing in a different context. So one example would be lots of behavioural interventions are trying to draw on our insights into what works in shifting behaviour and then apply it in a different context. So one example that the Behavioural Insights team in the UK did, which is an organisation that's also span out of government, and Nesta owns a third of it. The interesting example early on in that organisation's history was applying the knowledge that when people know that other people do something, it tends to influence their behaviour. So when a letter was sent to people about their taxes, if you say that 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, that increased the speed with which people respond. And that's been an innovation that has helped speed up tax collection and fine and penalty collection in multiple contexts and countries now. But that was inspired by the behavioural literature in other contexts. Even in areas where you think that's real invention, that's real eureka moments, I think often it's building on existing evidence and solutions. So this week alone, there was a interesting innovation talked about in relation to solar PV. And it was a new coating that potentially can increase the efficiency of solar PV production, but actually involves coating a traditional cell rather than entirely inventing something new. So again, it's a lot of adaptation and building on existing work. I do think, however, and this comes to challenging my own thinking on this area, sometimes innovation really does involve challenging the evidence. So for instance, let me give you one example also in malnutrition, where there was an established protocol for treating malnutrition that was working, but based on lots of insights in the field, there was a sense that it could be different and we could actually create a new combined protocol that did things rather differently. And some people said, well, don't set your face against something that's working already, don't reinvent the wheel, but actually we designed and tested something, rigorously evaluated it, and it's more cost effective than the existing 2 protocols, it's simpler. Another example would be coaching interventions for teachers. And this was an interesting example whereby DFID at the time didn't even want to fund the evaluations in crisis-affected contexts because they said, look, we know that coaching works much better than teacher training. Giving people a drip feed of information rather than a one-off batch is much better. But as it happened, when we started to implement this in some crisis-affected contexts, the results were not good. In fact, they were negative. Our hypothesis was that sometimes the coaches were coming from inspector backgrounds and were not actually either great at role modeling how to teach well, but also had a slightly authoritarian mindset. And therefore we tried to then design a coaching platform that was virtual with a virtual coach. And so that's an example where even if we're setting our face against the evidence, it's quite useful to first test it and then help that lead to something else. Just one final thing on this, which is evidence is obviously not the only thing to consider in program design. And this is where I think it's important to not play top trumps and assume that this is going to be the only thing that determines program design. And one example would be, for me, again in the teaching space, some quite technically sound and rigorous content that was produced when we were doing work in Tanzania. But while the teaching content and the teaching manuals were very good, they were just not user-friendly, and they were not engaging and inspiring teachers. And when we had designers engage with that content, it was more challenging than I thought, and more challenging than the technical folk thought, because it wasn't just about making something prettier and more digestible. It involved quite fundamentally changing the dosage and amount of information you give, and therefore changing the technical content. So I think that evidence-informed innovation is not just about rigorous evidence, it's about evidence from other sources, formative research, user feedback, that then has to blend into the design. So, I mean, I'll stop there. I think my main point is that sometimes innovation is just too detached from evidence. And, we shouldn't revel as innovators in ignoring it. We should use it as inspiration, either to build on the stuff that does work or fill the gaps in our knowledge. I haven't talked about a lot of the work I've done in things like violence reduction, or in trying to build evidence in productivity and economic change. And sometimes that's because we lack the evidence of what works in those areas, and the lack of evidence has inspired us to get involved.
I have a quick, Joe, before we go, just a quick follow-up question, Ravi, because you've really done a nice job there breaking down all the different ways, innovation delivery systems, innovation in the adaptation of programs, innovation. What about also innovation in the generation of evidence in the first place? So my hypothesis is a lot of the time, some of the time, the evidence community, the innovation community don't always see them, innovation can turn its back on evidence. And there's a lot of complicated reasons for that. But one of them is sometimes the evidence generation is slow. If we're talking about the systematic review community, there's a lot of interesting things happening in terms of how to generate rapid evidence assessments faster and do it just as rigorous. So just have a couple of comments on innovation and evidence generation as well that you've seen, which might enable the innovation community to come to. Do you have any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, a few quick thoughts. One, if you look at the work of the Behavioural Insights team, they've done quite a lot of rapid RCTs and trying to make sure that they are not as rigorous as perhaps something that's been done over many years with a large field study, but it's good enough to inform the next stage of program design. So, you might do a rapid RCT to try to work out whether parents respond better to brain-based images to inspire them to do parenting programs or more fun messaging. And that's a really useful and more rigorous way of testing what works than just pure formative research. But obviously that's not about testing impact at large scale. I think the other example I point to is some work that IRC did in Jordan, which was about using basically adaptive experimentation. So rather than assuming that the learning comes after the RCT, can you do some adaptive targeting within the program so that there is learning on an ongoing basis? And I think that's hugely attractive for program participants and deliverers, because who wants to be part of a program for many years within a crisis but unable to adapt? That feels almost quite, disabling. And so I think innovations in that space will make it easier for implementers to get on board.
Fabulous. Joe, over to you. Feel free to react to what Ravi's saying, build on it.
Well, I think, I think what's really interesting for me, Ravi, is that all the things that you've been talking about is all the things we're experiencing as a foundation. How do you navigate yourself around that when you're not an innovation expert or an evaluation expert, but you're actually coming from a different kind of community that's trying to actually make sense of all of that in order to work out what do you actually kind of fund. And you know, what I liked about your last example around RCTs and like waiting for a long time. One of the things we funded in WA was a birth cohort study. And one of the things they wanted to do was actually nest research within the birth cohort study. So rather than actually just watching what happens in that birth cohort study, researching them and putting it out, they're actually intervening. And at the time, it was the first time that was actually happening. And when that was brought to us, again, from a non-medical kind of lens, we were like, what? So normally on a birth cohort study, you just do the research and like see what happens, like even when you see that things are kind of happening. And so it's been really interesting that from that initial investment, there's a whole bunch of organizations that are now beginning to kind of think about that and do that and collaborate with each other. And again, like because we fund a number of them, they kind of said that they felt like they had permission from us to do that collaborating, rather than normally they wouldn't have been able to collaborate because of the way that their funding and research structures had been kind of set up. So like you say, I think there's lots of ways around building evidence, but actually cracking open the evidence building from an innovation perspective also seems like something really important for us to do if we actually want to kind of make the kind of change that we're all after. But I had a lovely conversation with my 11-year-old because I posed a question to them, like, evidence-informed innovation, is it an oxymoron? And she said to me, no, Mommy, it's a paradox. And I was like, wow, okay. So right. You've obviously getting a much better education than I was, because I don't even really understand what a difference between a paradox and an oxymoron is. But I really liked her interpretation of that. And that got me thinking about like, well, how do we use it? And it felt to me that actually we're aspiring to use an evidence-informed innovation approach. Particularly if you define it as a problem-solving approach to a specific challenge. So we're trying to break cycles of disadvantage. And as you were saying, Ravi, actually this is about the integration of the best evidence alongside involvement with those that have got lived experience, ideally at all levels, practitioner expertise, but also community preferences and values. So how do you take the evidence and embed all of that work in order to actually create the change that you're after? And I suppose, you know, from our perspective, we want to fund activities that create change. You know, we work with practitioners that want to deliver programs and activities that really are going to support that change. So how, you know, knowing that something works, and as you quite rightly say, then it's actually the difficulty of implementing that or executing that in a way that's going to stick within the existing systems, it's going to create new systems, or it's going to be able to adapt to specific contexts. And I think that's the challenge that certainly from this side of the fence on philanthropy, we're all trying to crack. Like, how do we actually know like what works, and then how do we fund stuff that's actually going to be able to take what works and make it happen in different kind of contexts? So I'm wondering whether the tension between evidence and innovation is actually helpful in that it helps us with the uncertainty of change, and that's the innovation bit. The innovation bit holds us in the uncertainty of knowing whether something is actually going to work or not. And I was thinking about the first thing that we funded. So the first thing we funded 4 years ago was the Black Dog Institute. And I could tell from the people on the call from Australia that will be familiar to many of you on the call. And it's an integrated approach to suicide prevention. So it takes 9 evidence-informed strategies, and it takes community-led implementation and service delivery approach, and then it integrates all the perspectives and the needs and context of those multiple sectors, the communities and the organizations, and it tries to see whether you can actually simultaneously like use those evidence-based strategies in order to reduce suicide within those communities. So for me, I was like, oh, that's a great example of evidence-based innovation, because all of those, why it's called evidence-informed is because all of those 9 strategies have got different levels of evidence when they were using them. And so the trial sites are actually trying to build evidence as alongside actually the implementation. So we funded 4 sites. Through that funding, in the end, Black Dog are involved in 29 separate suicide prevention trials across the country. And what they've learned through those trial sites is exactly what you were saying, and that many people will resonate with, that actually it's the quality of implementation that matters. and you can have the best evidence in the world, but even the most predictive will have limited impact if it's not implemented effectively. So I feel like, you know, as you described, that's one of the frontiers. How do we broker that knowledge and evidence in order to create the long-term change that we see? And how do we ensure that it's, as you said, not just the evidence, but it is also those of lived experience, also the communities that we're working in, and understanding the context kind of around that. So like I say, over the times that we've been funding, we've kind of tested a few things. So we took the most evidence-based, rigorously trialed online health program globally, which is proven to reduce alcohol consumption, binge drinking, cannabis use, ecstasy use, reduce psychological distress, all aimed at adolescents. And it's been, you know, rigorously tested across 71 schools and thousands of students in Australia. But the question for us is now, how do you get that into every school in Australia when health is funded by the feds, education is state-based, every state and territory has a different system about how you get things introduced. So again, the challenge for us is exactly as you described, how do you join the dots? And how do you actually kind of use the innovation part in order to get the evidence at scale in a way that's actually create the change that we're looking for?
And we're getting some questions in some chats, and I want to just read out one of the questions to both of you. It's a bit of a long question, so get your pen ready. In our work as an NGO working in healthcare, we often use innovation to generate evidence or integrate evidence in the design of innovative new projects or products. But we struggle at the end stages of this project when it comes to scaling up, adapting, or even abandoning the innovation. And I'm going to emphasize that bit, abandoning something. Maybe that's innovative in and of itself. How could evidence support decisions at the end stages of the innovation cycle? How do you scale up innovations effectively? Ravi, you want to take that first?
Yeah. So I think it's, as we all know, one of the really difficult things in any innovation process is to kill your favorite ideas that you've poured your heart and soul into. I think that's rigorous. I think that's actually almost easier later on because you've actually got some rigorous data to say whether it has an impact. What I think is sometimes harder is almost early on when you're prototyping and getting more qualitative feedback, you can sometimes probably continue with your hunch for too long. But I think that there are examples where either at the first rigorous evaluation or at the evaluation of the larger scale rollout, organizations have abandoned things. One good example was the nutrition work that Evidence Action did, where it did show impact early on, but then during the scaling process, they basically decided they were going to abandon it. And that was a really brave and good decision. I think what becomes, I think it becomes harder when you're in the sort of implementation science stage where you're continually optimizing to make bigger decisions. But hopefully by that point, you've got enough confidence in the intervention to be sticking with it.
Yeah, it's hard to, if you're iterating properly, you should be able to kind of improve on it. Jo, you want to take that?
Well, the best example I heard recently was related to social impact bonds. And that's kind of new ways of funding things, as you all know, and focused on outcomes. And there was this program that was supporting people who come out of prison. And they worked out after about 6 months that actually through the evaluation process, that actually was creating more harm than good. And of course, that information was kind of coming into the government department that was collecting the data and wasn't necessarily coming through the service provision. And so they ended up having this, really amazingly hard and brave conversation about how they're all going to pull it. And that work had been happening like for a long time and had been seen as kind of best practice. And so I agree, actually, if you're going to kill something, you actually really have to have really good evidence that it's not working, because otherwise our mental models are just too connected to the things that we've done for a long time, and it takes a long time to get to that tipping point. And for me, I think it was the fact that it was being independently, kind of the data was being collected, and that actually you really couldn't ignore what was happening, which meant that things had to happen, because we know there's lots of things that are being implemented that actually don't work, and actually creating harm, and they don't get killed.
Yep, plenty of examples about that. Let me come at it. There's a question here that a lot of us will be familiar with. So we often run into the term innovation as a way for people to get funding, so that it can be attractive to funders, maybe less attractive to fund something that has seen as have some evidence and some traction. So innovation being seen as something that is new, or at least someone's claiming that it's new. To your point, Ravi, often a lot of things aren't as new and are often building on other things that have come before. And so could you talk a little bit about maybe that definition of innovation, or people sometimes understanding that that's what innovation means? And if you could touch on some ethics around that in terms of funding innovation where it could be something brand new and it hasn't been tested, tried, evaluated at all. Just your thoughts on either of those 2 points. Jo, you want to start?
Sure. I actually think this is really tricky, because I actually think part of the issue is how things get funded. And so, one of the things that we discuss in philanthropy is that everybody wants to fund the new stuff. Everybody wants to be a catalytic philanthropist that starts something, but actually changing our mindsets that then when something works, and we're in for the long haul, when we're looking for that holy grail of sustainability. So there's something in your question which I think is really important around ethics, and is also about the way that we fund kind of things. And then, I used to work for an organisation that used to use a consultative process that wasn't used by many services, but it's now called human-centred design, but it wasn't then. And, for a long time, we talked about our innovative process. And although many other, if we were a domestic organisation, it was already being done in international development, but that was a way of ours also spreading the word of this way of working. So although we acknowledged that it wasn't new in other sectors, and that it was quite well known and it had, kind of good evidence behind it, we did talk about it being new and got a lot of funding around it being a new process, because in the sector that we were working with, it was new. And although we always talked about kind of the background to it, most people wanted something that was kind of shiny and new, that hadn't kind of gone before. So we always try and work out that if we are going to do something new, in the way that we talk to the people that we fund, we're always looking at where it's come from, what it's built on, whether the understanding of whether it's being used in different kind of sectors, because we think that's a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. And we've really tried to stop this rhetoric about everything being unique and everything being innovative. And we're now kind of rewarding people that we work with for understanding kind of the history of work, their work and other sectors' work, but also how they're kind of collaborating with people to build on work that's already happened. And I think that's beginning to shift the ethics a bit about how we talk about funding.
Robbie?
So when I had innovation in my job title, Chief Innovation Officer, it was quite amusing to others, because I often used to not use that word and hate using that word in any proposal, because I think it has been overused and sort of emptied of meaning. And actually, I think it has created a backlash, where people's first reaction when they hear the word innovation sometimes is, this is either fetishizing the novel, or this is somebody who's doing exactly as you suggest, trying to get funding and pretending something is more novel than it really is. So I quite favour sometimes just using a description without claiming that it's innovative, and perhaps show rather than tell. I actually think that can be sometimes more effective from a sort of funding perspective, just given the backlash on this. I think that on the ethics of innovation without proper evaluation, that's where I think it's really important to basically say within the innovation process, what is the measurement and evaluation that is appropriate to the right stage of that project. So let's not do RCTs and things prematurely, but let's also make sure that there is a route to this being rigorously evaluated at some point. And I think both from a funder perspective and a practitioner perspective, being able to explain what your innovation builds on in terms of evidence and how it's generating evidence that is appropriate to the stage of maturity of the project is a really good discipline.
Okay, I'm going to change tact a little bit. This is a question that was for you, Ravi, but Joe, I also want to hear what you have to say about this. Ravi, could you please give an example of your experience where evidence helped inform and implement an innovative culture in an organization?
Wow, that's difficult. Evidence informing.
I know, that's why I threw it at you. It was like, and if you need thinking music, I can give you thinking music. Dun, dun, dun.
That's really interesting. So I think the one I would try to illustrate is the sort of evidence around behavioural science, where I think there's lots and lots of ways in which you can apply that in how you run your organisation, in terms of how you run meetings or prime people, or be more efficient in use of time. So that's the one where I would say personally, both at the IRC and in Nesta, I think the evidence base around behaviour change is something that is informing how I lead and how I try and shift the organisation. It was actually an example of actually trying to apply that during COVID, where we were thinking, how do we get people to do hand washing, and just trying to make the messaging more salient by, and all that kind of stuff was something that we applied. But very difficult question, Robin.
So you're nudging people all over the place. Is that what's happening? You just got in there and you're just like nudging them to get things in on time? No, I'm teasing you.
Well, I think actually a really good example is in the civil service. So if you think about every single civil servant, I used to be a civil servant, so I can say this, but every single submission usually involves an interesting choice architecture where one option is pathetic, one is ludicrously bold and aggressive, and there is a nice, sensible middle option that you are always leading your ministers to. And that's, standard manipulation.
Joe, would you like to add to that?
I love this question. I've got a slightly different.
Congratulations, Marcello.
I don't know whether it answers it, Marcello. So you can rate us out of 10. So I think actually, in the organisations I've worked, trying to implement an innovation culture has been hard, where we have an opinion of ourselves of experts on things. And I think this is where the balance is between you being an expert in a particular field and using kind of evidence. So the most innovative organisation I've worked for was actually the one I was talking about before, where we had embedded in our practice human-centered design. And as we were commissioned to work with particularly marginalised groups on behavioural change, our whole process, understood what was happening from the evidence, but we didn't start thinking about solutions until we'd gone out and spoken to people who were experiencing the issue. And so I know we do it differently these days, but actually just that whole thing of listening to people and trying to understand what was happening from a technical perspective and a cultural perspective, and then involving them then in the how do we deal with this issue, and change your behavior? This is no surprise to any of you, that the stuff that they come up with, we would not have come up with. And so actually doing that consistently as a process, as a means, meant that we had super bright people who would read all the evidence, but they wouldn't jump to kind of conclusions, and they were always thinking about the users at the center of that. And so, I think it's about permission. I think it's about processes. And I think it's about expectation. Whereas in organisations I've worked for, where I'm being held as an expert in something, then there's a performative nature to that. And yes, I can read up and but the expectation is that I'm going to have the answer to that. And I think the organisations I've worked in, where there's a really strong innovation culture, there's a culture of being able to say, I don't know the answer to that. How are we going to work on this in a collaborative way together? And sadly, I feel like that's really rare.
Yeah.
One other thing, Robin, I'd say is that, again, in the International Rescue Committee, we had something called the Outcomes and Evidence Framework, whereby every single one of our programs had a theory of change, and we graded the degree of evidence in each of those areas. And we tried to also collect cost data for all of that. And what I think that did was give us a stimulus to say, where do we feel really confident and we just want to scale things versus where do we want to actually improve cost efficiency or build more solid evidence? So the evidence was a stimulus for where and how to innovate.
Yeah, interesting. We had, I've got a follow-up question to that, but let me go to Chris's question. Again, just moving tact. There's a lot of questions and themes here, and I feel as an implementation person myself, I always feel like compelled to ask them, but I'm going to try. So there's a few people going, we've referred several times to the quality of implementation or innovation and delivery systems. And somebody's asked if you could just break down a little bit what you mean. I think, Joe, you in particular referred to it. What do we mean by the quality of implementation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And for me, it's particularly this is informed by the organizations that we've been working with around this. Like, how do you take something that's, been in one site and take it to other sites? And they tell me that the strategies and interventions have to be informed by evidence, but they are adapted to the context and the needs of the communities, that there is engagement of the key sectors that you're working with, and there will be multiple systems and sectors. So in the example that we talked about earlier, so that would be health, education, media, first responders, justice, like community. Like, if you don't engage all of those sectors, like, then it means that you're not getting the whole picture. And I think particularly there was a point in Lifespan that they really felt like this was about simultaneous implementation and synchronized implementation, knowing that, the pace of implementation and how do you tailor that to the needs of the community. And then a really important thing is intermediary support. And this is something that the foundation is super interested in. Like, when you're working in multiple sites, like, how do you build the knowledge of the intermediary? So Black Dog would have seen themselves as the intermediary that was supporting the sites, so the sites could focus on implementation. But they did have, in place, it's called a backbone, but we've gone to a broader thing about implementation. And then knowing that you need dedicated regional partners if you're doing it, then like you need to build the capability of the workforce in the places that you're working. You can't fly in and out. And then the final one, of course, is data and evaluation, and how do you wrap all that around for decision making, and ultimately policy, to try and change kind of policy. So it's so multi-dimensional, and I definitely will have missed stuff, but for us, I think that's why this is so tricky, isn't it? Because actually,
it is. If you go back and watch our first webinar, I think we were all, the three of us that wrote a book, were arguing about it. Ravi, what about you?
So do you mind reframing the question or repeating the question, Robin?
Well, this person in particular, and hi Joe, was interested in, we've talked a little bit about quality of implementation, but kind of haven't described what we mean by that. Have you got a way you can frame that up?
Yeah, I guess where I think about this is, sometimes you have some evidence that something works, but one, you want to really understand whether it's going to work in a different context. You want to understand who it works with and how, and whether there are particular challenges to scaling it up. So that requires, a lot of feedback and digging into the particular contextual variables. I think one of the biggest things I think about is, if you take an area in the UK like teaching practice, where the Education Endowment Foundation has done an excellent job in building a lot of rigorous evidence in what works in education, the translation of that into large-scale behaviour change by teachers on the ground is almost the next big challenge. And at the moment, we can't assume that you'll produce lovely research summaries that a few keen teachers will then inhale and then somehow even then practice. Yeah. Never mind that the vast majority of people who won't. So for me, I think there's innovation there in how we translate evidence into action, and how we make it relevant and resonant for practitioners.
Yeah. I'm going to change tack slightly because I think this is an interesting question here. So what forms of political and institutional innovation are required for evidence to not only be used, but not misused? And I think given the two countries that we are in, we would have a fair bit to say about that. Ravi, you want to take that first?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of the things that I think has been an interesting institutional innovation in the UK over the last 10 years has been the formation of things like What Works centres, which were really based on the National Institute for Clinical Excellence that emerged in health, which was quite easy in health, where you're making recommendations based on trials of drugs about whether it should be cost effective and therefore used in the NHS. And there was a desire to make it somewhat independent of political interference. And I think that basic premise is a really, really good one. I think the challenge is, one, it costs a lot of money and it requires heavy endowment of money, and it's worked very well in one context like education, but it's not worked in others where they've been underfunded. But really, the really difficult thing is, how does that evidence actually inform political decision making when electoral cycles are short? There are incentives to suddenly shift blame or suddenly respond to an issue. So I think that these institutional innovations only work with a sort of mature political culture where you can honestly say, we don't know what works, we need to start small, or we don't want to rush into this rollout because we actually need to wait for this to develop. And I think this is an area where we've probably gone backwards, obviously, in the last 10, 20 years. And it feels like the political discourse is less about what works and is less fact-based than it was. So I think this is where, institutional innovation, great, but it has to be located within a different political culture.
Oh, it's kind of a bit depressing, isn't it? I think I would agree. Like, we've got the rhetoric about evidence-based policy, but we actually struggle kind of about that. And there was this great. There was a bit of a movement around social return investment as well in Australia. It was like that seemed to be the piece of evidence that politicians particularly would listen, would read and kind of and make decisions around. But that's also kind of shifted too. So I think kind of to answer your question, I think, as Ravi said, it's almost like a return to the expertise of public servants. And understand, and actually I think in Australia with COVID, like we've seen a little measure of that, like the responses of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, that came out of the federal public service and has actually served us really well. And I think there's been, we're all quite excited that this particular global pandemic, both from a federal and a state perspective, that people have been listening to evidence in some areas and have been kind of responding to that. So we know, particularly in the early childhood development sector, there's been great pieces of research and they have been being used to inform kind of what's happening. It doesn't mean we always kind of get it right. So I think in Australia, there's conversations at a kind of policy level that we're trying to work out how do we hold that open so we can continue with that. So maybe, one of the good things about having a global pandemic is that people shift a bit and actually, they need different kinds of answers. And so then they look to the kind of evidence. But on the whole, otherwise, it has been quite difficult to get evidence in. And lifespan that I talked about at the beginning, one of the reasons why we ended up funding it is because they couldn't get funding from the government to do it. But actually our funding leveraged both state and federal government to kind of come in. So I think there's, it's also about who do governments partner with and who do they listen to, and how do we build different coalitions who are talking about the evidence that we're interested in to try and get that changed. And I'm not sure I have a lot of suggestions about how we stop it from being misused.
The person that asks, I think, does. I'm going to try and sort of sum this a little bit, see if I can bring this together, and then ask each of you to comment on how well I do that, or your reaction to it, and then we'll. So it sounds like there's some thoughts that it would be innovative to use evidence full stop at times, so that itself could be innovation. It sounds like when you're both thinking about innovation, we're talking about innovation at multiple levels. So it may not necessarily just be what the new thing is, but innovation in the adaptation of something that is shown to work in one context, and we need to think about it for another context. The innovation in delivery systems and continuous improvement and iterating and sticking with it. There could be innovations in stopping things, so that it's not sort of a binary choice, is what I've heard you say over the last hour, that it's not an either or, but an informed by each other. And then at other times, innovation being something quite fresh that does need to be tested. My last sort of comment to you is just to test out, are we talking about all levels of the integration of evidence and innovation? Is there then an implicit understanding that people need to have more of an understanding about the quality of evidence? So you both know that not all evidence is created equal. One type, as you were saying, Ravi, expert opinion, is a type of evidence, but so is the results of a really well done systematic review that in an unbiased way just shares what we know and what we don't about a particular topic. All forms of evidence with their different kind of limitations and benefits, if you like. So is there something about, to enable innovation in the use of evidence, or for innovation to drive better evidence, do we need to understand a little bit more collectively outside of academia about different levels of evidence? And would also, on some level, I hear people talk about engaging end users as something that is innovative. And I think as an ex-reform psychologist, it seems a little sad that we think that was innovative in the first place, given they are the people that we would be serving. So is there a place to sort of make that more of a less innovative and an obvious point? I'll stop there. Ravi, I'll go to you, and then you go last, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, on the last point, when thinking about program design, trying to incorporate insights from the evidence base, but also from the context, but also from the end users, just seems so important when you're generating solutions. And all of them have got a huge importance. I think you sort of sum things up nicely, Robin. I think the question about, are we sophisticated interpreters and consumers of evidence, for those of us who are not in the academic community, I think is super important. And when I compare the world of international development, which is one that I was in, to domestic policymaking in the UK, it feels worlds apart. Yeah, because in international development over the last 10, 15 years, there's been such a big push on rigorous evidence that you couldn't have been in that world without somehow becoming a bit more literate about these debates. And I think we're still at the very early stages of that development in the UK when I think about quite a large parts of the practice and policymaking community. So for instance, how do you make sure you don't over-interpret a single study versus making sure there's a body of evidence? How do you think critically about things? How do you also make sure you are humble enough to know that evidence changes? Science reveals new insights, so let's not be too definitive. So I think that the previous question about institutions is really, really important. The What Works centres is an important thing, but within our civil service, within our kind of training programs for public servants, how do we make sure that we really upgrade our capacity to interpret and apply evidence? Feels very important. Actually, there's even a question about things like audit institutions and accounting institutions. Why is it that we assess value for money in a very narrow way about use of resources, rather than whether we're actually confident in the programs themselves? So I think that's where sort of significant institutional overhaul, where evidence becomes more central in many areas, could be useful.
Perfect. Joe?
Yeah, I think the answer is yeah. Like as a lay person, not as a person who is an implementation scientist, or has been involved in kind of RCTs, I think the answer is definitely yes. Like it is really difficult to interpret and to work out, like, you know, what's good and what to do with it. And I think what's been really fascinating with our social change approaches, and I completely agree with Ravi that we're in a very similar position in Australia, I would say. But, you know, we've got about 92 place-based initiatives across the country where communities are trying to work out how they lead their own change. And one of the massive barriers has been around that is how do you bring evidence to those organizations, so to those communities, so that they can make choices. And, you know, I've been really impressed with people like Telethon Kids Institute that are really thinking about that, around place and early childhood development, around Our Place in Victoria, that's also brokering that evidence and meaning that you can have community engagement, but you don't need to be an academic to work out what the evidence is. And we funded another project which is actually working with teachers for exactly that reason, Ravi. It's like, how can you work out you know, what you should be doing with your teaching practice if you haven't got the skills about working out what's good evidence or not. And so I think this is really important, and I think, you know, we yeah, it's been done, it's not that hard, and again, it's that question of who's going to fund it. And how is that kind of going to work? So that brokering of knowledge piece, I think, really is that kind of the important bit that we get right next.
Yeah. I'm going to read a fantastic quote here, and I just love this. I want to say a weird thank you to all panelists. As an aged care and disability services provider CEO, I really, capital letters, needed to hear from intelligent people about how we treat innovation, given that almost every, capital letters, not-for-profit is revisiting their strategic plans ongoing. Please provide more webinars. Thank you. There's a couple you could go back to, but I totally understand, particularly in aged care and disability in Australia right now with COVID, I bet you could use a break on all sorts of levels. So thank you, you two. There are many more questions that I couldn't get to in comments, both in the Q&A and the chat. We will hopefully capture that. This conversation, this kind of panel, this kind of thinking is exactly what the summit next year is about. Those of you in the UK will be able to join, Southeast Asia will be able to join, the US will have to join overnight. So please sign up to more of these webinars. You can watch them anytime. You two were terrific. We didn't even do any prep, so I thank you very much for being such experienced presenters on Zoom. And for those of you that are interested in the next webinar, a very good colleague and friend of ours at CEI, Renard, who's a hotshot up-and-coming behavioural and implementation scientist, and there's only a few of us that can claim both of those things in mental health intervention. So I'm going to interview Renard next month, and please join that. And thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, you too. And if we were like in one place, I'd give you wine or flowers or something, I don't know, chocolate. Or
I'd have an unproductive day if that was the case, Robin.
Yeah, I'd like to see that though. Joe and I wouldn't mind. It's a very appropriate time for us. But thank you, everybody. We're
Thanks very much.
This off now. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.